Oakley, California, wasn't the kind of place where people vanished. It was quiet, predictable, the kind of town where neighbors still waved across driveways and families knew each other by name. But on the night of January 26, 2022, something broke that pattern. Quietly, cleanly, and without a trace. A 24-year-old woman named Alexis Gabe didn't come home. Her family called, texted, waited. The hours dragged past midnight. The next morning, her father found her car abandoned on a residential street just a few miles away. The door was ajar. The keys were still in the ignition. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no broken glass. But there was also no Alexis. She had gone to retrieve some belongings from her ex-boyfriend's house in Antioch earlier that evening. It was supposed to be routine. She'd done it before. They had ended things a few months back, in November, but the split had been somewhat civil, at least on the surface. She hadn't told many people about the trip, but she didn't seem afraid. By the time law enforcement got involved, 24 hours had passed. Every hour beyond that widened the gap between last known contact and potential leads. Her cell phone was off. Her social media activity had stopped completely. No credit card usage. No ATM withdrawals. Oakley PD initiated a missing persons investigation. At first glance, there was no reason to assume foul play, but there was also no reason for her to disappear voluntarily. She had plans for the weekend. She was close to her parents. Her mother said she had just spoken to her the day before. Nothing seemed off. The first procedural step, vehicle forensics. Her car was towed and a full trace evidence sweep was conducted. No latent blood detected, no evidence of forced entry, no fingerprints beyond Alexis's, and partial smudges too degraded to identify. One strand of long hair, consistent with her own, was located on the headrest. There was no purse in the vehicle, no phone. That wasn't unusual in and of itself. People take those with them. But what stood out was the placement of the keys, still in the ignition, in a neighborhood Alexis had no ties to. Investigators cross-referenced the location with known associates. No direct hits. Within 48 hours, they turned their attention to the last known person to see her alive, Marshall Jones III. The name wasn't unfamiliar. He'd been her boyfriend for over 2 years. No criminal record, no prior domestic disturbance calls, a clean employment history, no immediate red flags on paper. But when detectives reached out, his responses were procedural, controlled. He confirmed that Alexis had come by that evening, said she left around 9:01 p.m. No argument, nothing unusual, just picked up her things and left. Still, the story didn't track. Her phone had last pinged at 6:43 p.m. near the Antioch address. After that, radio silence. GPS showed no movement beyond a tight radius around the home. Not toward Oakley, not anywhere. At the time, that wasn't enough. But the odd thing about clean data is how unnatural it can be. The absence of normal behavior often reveals more than it hides. Alexis was a habitual texter. Her battery had been at 78% when last checked via account sync. There was no reason for her phone to die so soon after. Investigators requested mobile tower logs, but they needed time. Meanwhile, the family went public. Flyers, press conferences, community searches. And then came the first physical anomaly. The location where her car was found. An address with no known ties to Alexis, but less than 5 miles from Jones's home. It wasn't a commercial area, no cameras, low foot traffic, a drop zone. Within 3 days, detectives obtained a preliminary search warrant, not for arrest, but for digital surveillance polls, traffic cam records, doorbell video coverage, and cell tower triangulation for January 26 between 5:00 p.m. and 11:00 p.m. One frame stood out. 8:42 p.m., a shadowy figure walking eastbound near where Alexis's vehicle was found. Hood up, a large bag slung low over the shoulder. Video quality was poor, but the timing and direction aligned with a possible drop-off. The timestamp was troubling. Jones had said she left around 9 was. But if that was her car, and that was the drop, then the car was staged earlier than he admitted. And if she didn't drive it there, someone else did. This was no longer just a missing persons case. It was something else. By the third day, the Alexis Gabe investigation had shifted from hopeful to technical. The press still framed it as a disappearance, But within the Oakley Police Department, that language had already changed. The word used was interruption, as in, her life didn't continue, and there were no signs she had planned it that way. The forensic strategy entered phase one, digital reconstruction. Analysts pulled activity logs from Alexis's phone carrier, Apple ID account, and cloud-synced apps. Her last outgoing message had been sent at 6:37 p.m. on January 26th. The phone had disconnected from the network at 6:43 p.m. That 6-minute window would become a permanent gap in the investigation. No new data, no outgoing calls, no Wi-Fi reconnection attempts. Investigators traced the phone's location data to a tight cell radius near the 600 block of Bentry Way, Antioch. The ex-boyfriend's known residence sat inside that radius. The story given by him, that she had left around 9 p.m., conflicted with the last digital proof of life by nearly 2.5 hours. That was the first actionable inconsistency. Phones don't lie. People do. The car, already processed for prints and trace materials, yielded no new findings after lab enhancement, but the secondary sweep of the vehicle's GPS module was more useful. Investigators discovered the internal navigation system had recorded a prior address search, Bentry Way. It confirmed Alexis had used the vehicle's onboard system to navigate there, but nothing showed she'd used it to leave. Meanwhile, surveillance polls from public traffic cams and private home security feeds painted a narrow but developing picture. At 8:42 p.m., a silhouette appeared on a private driveway, cam roughly 4 blocks from where Alexis's car was found. It was a male wearing a hoodie, carrying a large black trash bag in his right hand. The video was in black and white, low resolution, and lacked audio. Still, it was enough for law enforcement to label the footage of interest. They couldn't confirm identity, but they could work with the timestamp. From that moment on, the approach shifted to timeline-based exclusion. The entire evening was divided into 15-minute blocks. 5:30, 6:45 p.m. confirmed arrival at Antioch residence via GPS plus phone activity, 6:45, 8 hours p.m. Blackout window, no outgoing communication, no verified movement, 8:09, 15 p.m. Possible car relocation, figure observed near drop site. 9:00 p.m., claimed departure time, unsupported by any digital evidence, no Uber records, no rideshare logs, no bus card use. No outbound movement by Alexis herself could be traced beyond 6:45 p.m. This gave detectives 2 concrete anchors, the digital silence at 6:43 p.m. and the camera footage at 8:42 p.m. Everything else was assumption. The forensic team also launched parallel data inquiries. Cell tower dumps from all devices, pinging off the same towers at the time of the disappearance, transaction logs from nearby gas stations and ATMs, license plate reader hits on highways and intersections between Antioch and Oakley. None of them placed Alexis outside that narrow corridor. At this stage, media coverage intensified. Flyers circulated across counties. Billboards were authorized. Volunteers coordinated community searches. But behind the scenes, detectives became increasingly focused on a smaller and smaller radius of activity and one person inside it. Still, protocol required control. They didn't want to confront anyone without a stronger forensic backbone. So the next move came from digital forensics, recovery of deleted content. With a court order, technicians examined a backup of Alexis's iCloud account, which revealed her calendar. On January 26th, she had scheduled a pickup at 6 p.m., labeled simply, "Marshall, get boxes." Nothing after that. Her digital presence stopped there. So the question wasn't just where did she go? It was also, why did her phone die exactly when it did? Phones don't suddenly shut off at 78% battery. That level of charge could last hours, unless manually powered off or destroyed. That kind of silence often points to only 2 scenarios, flight or foul play, and Alexis had left no signs of either. When investigators cross-checked security footage around the ex-boyfriend's neighborhood, no additional vehicles were recorded arriving or leaving during the critical window. Her car was seen once, inbound, never outbound. That fact prompted a rare internal memo between detectives. If the vehicle didn't leave by her hand, then who moved it? And why would they choose that location? It was a good question, because the street where Alexis's car was found, Trenton Street, had no security cameras, minimal lighting, and no through traffic. It was quiet, a cul-de-sac. Whoever chose it didn't want to be seen. That level of intentionality changed the case classification. On February 3rd, exactly 1 week after the disappearance, Oakley PD reclassified the incident from missing adult to suspicious circumstances, potential homicide. The tone shifted accordingly. If Alexis was no longer treated as missing, then everything about the scene, her phone, the car, the radio silence, had to be viewed as staging. And staging implied a degree of planning, which meant whoever was responsible wasn't panicked. They were calm, calculated, and possibly very, very close. 9 days after Alexis Gabe was last seen, the investigation pivoted from passive tracing to active collection. The digital trail had run dry. Her phone had gone dark. Her vehicle had yielded no decisive forensic breakthroughs. So detectives shifted focus to physical evidence, particularly in the area surrounding the last known location and the drop site where her car had been left. A search grid was established across both Antioch and Oakley, prioritizing areas with low visibility and poor surveillance coverage. Among the locations identified was a stretch of roadside property near Bentry Way, where multiple residential trash bins had been reported overflowing in the days after the disappearance. Nothing about that alone was suspicious, except for one address, where trash had not been collected since the week of January 26. That house belonged to Marshall Jones III. Investigators obtained a second warrant to access trash bins on the property, including the large rolling receptacle stored behind a privacy fence. The search team located 3 black garbage bags that had been left sealed and tucked into the corner of the yard. What they found inside shifted the entire case. Inside one of the bags were discarded latex gloves, several sheets of used paper towels, and a receipt from a local hardware store in Antioch. The purchase, dated January 25th, included duct tape, industrial garbage bags, and heavy-duty cleaning solution. The total came to just under $42. The gloves were collected for lab testing. Swabs were taken from the interior lining for trace DNA. A separate team processed the receipt for latent prints. While the results would take several days to return, the presence of the items alone, combined with the timing, was consistent with post-crime concealment. But the real turning point wasn't what was in the bags. It was what was found upstairs. While executing the same search warrant, officers checked the upstairs bedroom of the Antioch residence. Inside a desk drawer in the main bedroom was a folded piece of paper. It was handwritten, clearly not typed, and labeled at the top, "Directions to remote site." The directions detailed a route through Amador County, over 70 miles northeast of Antioch. Landmarks were referenced by name. Turn right at Bridge W guardrails, 5 miles past Logging Road intersection, and Red Gate, side trail, go left. The instructions ended with, "Keep going until incline disappears. No lights." The note was seized. A handwriting analyst was brought in. Preliminary review suggested the writing was consistent with samples previously submitted during the voluntary interview phase. Though not sufficient as standalone proof, the note's presence, coupled with the proximity of the bags and the timing of their disposal, provided circumstantial alignment. Investigators also recovered a half-used roll of duct tape inside the garage that matched the brand on the receipt. One length of the tape appeared to have adhered to the lid of a 5-gallon bucket, which was tested for blood using phenolphthalein. Initial field tests returned negative. The bucket was sent to the crime lab for luminol processing and chemical enhancement. At this stage, the case had evolved from speculative foul play to suspected concealment of a deceased person. The timing on the note matched the cell data blackout. The receipt from the hardware store was purchased 1 day before Alexis's last known communication. The gloves in the trash bore a reddish residue, and while it didn't appear to be blood under initial light, it was flagged for biological testing. No body had been found, but the sum of the materials pointed toward preparation, not panic. During this process, law enforcement also quietly began reviewing surveillance video from nearby properties where Jones's mother resided. Though she had not been named a suspect, she had regular contact with her son and had access to both the Antioch home and an SUV registered in her name. One clip from a neighbor's Ring camera captured a figure believed to be Jones, carrying a black trash bag into the back of the SUV during early morning hours. The timestamp was 4:12 a.m., January 27th. That clip was placed alongside the handwritten directions, which ended in a location not far from where the SUV had later been spotted via automated license plate readers. The cumulative picture became harder to explain away. Still, no formal charges were filed. Law enforcement wanted to avoid premature conclusions. Without a body, without definitive DNA confirmation, and without direct witness statements, the evidence was strong, but not absolute. The district attorney's office urged caution, but inside the investigation team, momentum had shifted. What had begun as a routine missing persons report was now a suspected homicide with evidence of premeditation, and someone had taken time to plan every step of it. On March 29, 2022, the search radius expanded beyond Antioch. A specialized recovery team was dispatched to Amador County following analysis of the handwritten directions found during the residential search in Chapter 3. The note had indicated a path through the Sierra foothills, specific and rural. It wasn't the kind of area one stumbled into. Whoever had mapped it out knew the terrain or had studied it in advance. The search team used cadaver dogs trained to detect human decomposition. The K9 units began along the logging road referenced in the note. It was remote, uneven, and flanked by thick brush. Signal coverage was non-existent, and traffic was virtually nil. Roughly 4 hours into the sweep, at a wooded incline off the main path near Pine Grove, one of the dogs alerted. The alert was centered on a partially buried, black plastic bag wedged under loose leaves and rocks. The site was flagged and the area sealed. Inside the bag was a partial set of human remains, specifically a lower leg with a sock still partially intact. The tissue was in advanced decomposition, but the structure remained sufficiently preserved for medical examination. The scene was immediately treated as a body recovery site. Over the next 48 hours, forensic teams uncovered several additional bags. None contained a full body. Each bag had been individually sealed and buried at varying depths within a 20-foot radius. The spacing and concealment patterns suggested deliberate separation, likely an attempt to slow identification or avoid detection altogether. Forensic entomologists were brought in to assist with estimating time of death based on insect activity. Early analysis aligned with the known date of Alexis's disappearance. An autopsy was conducted on the partial remains. The official cause of death could not be determined due to the state of decomposition. However, there were no fractures consistent with blunt force trauma. No visible signs of gunshot entry or sharp force injuries were identifiable on the leg remains. DNA confirmation was required. Samples were expedited to the California Department of Justice lab in Richmond. 3 days later, results came back. The remains were positively identified as belonging to Alexis Gabe. Investigators reviewed the burial site's proximity to known roads. License plate reader data showed that a vehicle registered to a relative of the primary person of interest had passed through the Amador area on January 27th, less than 24 hours after Alexis was last seen. That alignment wasn't enough to press charges, but it validated the forensic link between the handwritten note and the disposal site. Of particular interest was the pattern of concealment. Each plastic bag had been double-lined. No clothing items were found beyond socks. No phone, no jewelry, no personal effects. It was evident the person responsible had taken steps to prevent traceability. A new phase of the investigation began. Comparative forensic analysis between the trash recovered at the Antioch property and the disposal materials used at the burial site. The plastic bags matched in size, thickness, and manufacturing code. Lab technicians found microscopic fiber transfer from the tape used on the garage bucket to one of the bags recovered in Amador County. This was the first direct material link between Alexis's former residence and her remains. Still, law enforcement maintained operational silence. No arrests were made. The case was being built piece by piece, not for probable cause, but for conviction. And inside the department, one quiet observation emerged from the lead investigator's notes. Every choice made in this disposal was practiced. This wasn't panic, this was management. The case now had both a victim and a body, but the person responsible had remained ahead of the system by just enough. The Amador recovery shifted everything. Until that point, the investigation had been stitched together with circumstantial inferences, digital gaps, inconsistencies in statements, fragments of surveillance. But now there were remains. Physical evidence tied to a known address, DNA confirmed, material transfer confirmed, and the timeline was no longer speculative, it was real. By early June 2022, a formal arrest warrant was issued for Marshall Curtis Jones III on suspicion of homicide and concealment of human remains. The Contra Costa District Attorney signed off. Probable cause had been met, but there was one complication. Jones was gone. According to DMV activity, his vehicle hadn't been seen in California since mid-May. Phone records showed deactivation, no credit card use, no toll activity. Investigators assumed he'd fled the state. That led to coordination with the U.S. Marshals and local agencies in Washington state. Jones had a known family connection in Kent, just south of Seattle. It wasn't an elaborate trail. He hadn't used burner devices or aliases, but his exit had been silent, precise. He knew when to disappear. On June 1, 2022, at 10:44 a.m., a tactical team approached a residential apartment on 99th Place South in Kent. They had confirmation he was inside. Entry was made under a high-risk apprehension protocol. As officers breached the front room, Jones moved toward them holding a large kitchen knife. Orders were shouted, but he kept advancing. A single officer discharged his weapon. Jones was struck multiple times and declared dead at the scene. There was no note, no verbal acknowledgement, no recorded confession. The scene was cleared and photographed. In the apartment, authorities found a bag packed with clothes, prepaid debit cards, and a handwritten list of potential off-grid locations, including camping zones and abandoned ranger cabins in Idaho and Montana. There was no direct mention of Alexis Gabe. The case now lacked a living suspect, but not accountability. After his death, a forensic analysis of Jones's laptop revealed a deleted folder titled Recovery. Inside were Google Maps printouts, terrain satellite shots of Amador County, and a PDF document titled How Law Enforcement Tracks Phones. The file had been downloaded on January 24. This was not an act of sudden rage. This had been studied. No additional remains of Alexis were ever recovered beyond what was found in Pine Grove. Searches continued in mapped zones mentioned in his files, but yielded nothing. Jones's family was interviewed again. His mother denied knowledge of the disposal or the location of the remains. No charges were filed against her due to lack of direct evidence. A public statement by the district attorney's office confirmed this, citing prosecutorial standards that could not be met. In the wake of his death, the case transitioned into its final phase, public closure without legal resolution. But inside law enforcement circles, there was consensus. This had been a containment operation. The truth was buried in parts, literally and strategically. For families like the Gabes, that kind of truth comes at a cost. There is no trial, no confession, no final word. But there was clarity in the investigation's conclusion. Every action by Jones post-disappearance aligned with evasion and destruction of evidence. Every object found had a purpose, and that's often what defines guilt more clearly than anything spoken. After the death of Marshall Jones, the case reached a technical end, but not a complete one. The core forensic questions remained. Why were only partial remains found? What happened to the rest of Alexis Gabe's body? And what did that imply about the perpetrator's intent? Forensic anthropologists reviewed the burial site and body condition again in May 2023. Soil acidity, wildlife activity, and time of year were ruled out as explanations for the missing remains. The bags had been deliberately separated, buried in a mapped radius, and concealed using redundant plastic layers. The remains that were found, limited to one leg and soft tissue, showed signs of artificial segmentation. There were no bone markings from scavengers, no environmental degradation strong enough to explain total decomposition. This was methodical partitioning, not natural decay. Digital evidence retrieved from Jones's devices had indicated prior interest in forensic science and police procedures. Browser history on his recovered laptop included research into decomposition rates by geography, odor control techniques, and remote terrain analysis software. He'd also downloaded open-source law enforcement manuals detailing search radius protocols, In short, he had studied how not to get caught. The presence of only partial remains, combined with material matched between the disposal bags and tape at the Antioch residence, painted a clear behavioral profile. This wasn't a failed concealment. It was planned to create partial resolution, enough to satisfy legal closure without providing the full truth. That strategy worked in part. The physical evidence was sufficient for a warrant, but with Jones's death, the legal process halted. No courtroom admission, no trial cross-examination, no full narrative. Search efforts to locate additional remains were scaled down by late 2023 after multiple unsuccessful deployments of cadaver dogs, sonar scanning, and ground-penetrating radar across Amador and adjacent counties. The terrain was too vast, and the disposal strategy too calculated. Investigators considered whether the other remains had been moved to a secondary site. Jones's last known travel route showed a 32-minute GPS gap between his last Antioch ping and his appearance on a toll road camera. That time window could account for a detour, possibly to another location that has never been identified. This case, from a prosecutorial standpoint, would be labeled closed. But from an investigative lens, the absence of total recovery marked it as incomplete. It is not unusual in homicide cases involving concealment for full remains never to be recovered, but it is rare for the disposal to be this strategic. The psychological profile supported that conclusion. The person responsible knew the victim personally. He had access, privacy, and time. And more importantly, he had motive not to leave behind a complete story. The Gabes held a private memorial with the recovered remains. They made the decision not to hold a public funeral, no symbolic closure. Their approach was consistent: seek facts, not dramatics. Still, in conversations with law enforcement, Alexis's family remained engaged. They pressed for full transparency of case files. They reviewed search grid overlays, forensic breakdowns, and even assisted in private grid searches with volunteers long after police resources were withdrawn. They weren't chasing hope. They were preserving accountability. There was one final data point that confirmed how far Jones had gone to ensure no one else would speak. The hard drive retrieved from his apartment had been partially wiped using third-party secure erase software. However, data recovery specialists were able to restore several deleted documents. One stood out. It was a checklist, titled Final Steps. Among the bullet points: clear garage, clean trunk liner, delete cloud, wipe iMessage pack, getaway bag, secure map copy. It ended with two words: no body. Once the primary suspect was deceased and forensic leads confirmed premeditated concealment, investigators turned their attention to the possibility of assistance, intentional or otherwise. The operation had been calculated, sustained over several days, and executed across multiple jurisdictions. The question was no longer just what had been done, but whether anyone else had enabled it. The focus narrowed to those with consistent proximity to Marshall Jones, before and after Alexis Gabe's disappearance. His mother, Alicia Coleman Clark, became a central figure of interest. Surveillance footage from January 27th, one day after Alexis was last seen, showed Jones loading black bags into the trunk of a vehicle registered in his mother's name. The timestamp was 4:12 a.m., the location outside the Antioch residence. There was no recorded activity from Alexis after 6:43 p.m. the night prior. A second video, retrieved from a neighbor's security system, placed Alicia's vehicle on the road approximately 90 minutes after the loading footage. That vehicle was later detected by an automated license plate reader traveling eastbound on Highway 88, consistent with the path to Amador County. The time, 6:03 a.m. When questioned, Alicia denied knowledge of any involvement. She stated that Marshall had used her vehicle occasionally and did not inform her of his destinations. She also claimed she was asleep during the early morning hours of the 27th and did not check the vehicle afterward. No forensic evidence placed Alicia directly at the disposal site. There were no prints or DNA recovered from the exterior of the bags. The garbage bags themselves were common industrial grade. No retail-level tracking possible. Investigators conducted luminol testing and fiber analysis on the trunk of her SUV. Results were inconclusive. A second point of interest came from digital correspondence. On January 25th, 2 days before Alexis's disappearance, Jones had texted his mother, "I'll need the car early Thursday. Shouldn't be gone long." That message aligned with the timeline, but provided no explicit detail. No further text between them regarding the car were recovered. Investigators cross-referenced Alicia's cell tower activity. Her phone remained in Antioch during the morning drive window. However, that alone did not confirm her location inside the home. A powered-on device can remain within a radius regardless of user proximity. Without vehicle GPS logs or dashcam footage, the occupant of the vehicle during the disposal trip could not be definitively established. The DA's office reviewed all materials and concluded that while suspicious, the evidence did not meet the threshold for criminal charges. There was no direct proof Alicia had knowledge of the crime, participated in it, or aided its concealment post-fact. The lack of charges prompted public criticism. The Gabe family expressed disappointment in media statements, questioning how a parent could remain uninformed while their vehicle was used in an interstate body disposal. But prosecutorial standards require more than moral suspicion. They require proof. Privately, investigators remained split. Some believed Alicia had been misled or manipulated by her son, who had, by all accounts, maintained a tight emotional grip on those close to him. Others believed her silence was tactical. That distinction, however, could not be proved without corroboration. One detail that stood out during re-examination. Despite extensive property searches and data recovery efforts, no correspondence, digital or written, was found expressing remorse, fear, or panic from Jones after Alexis's death. There were no personal writings, no messages to friends, no breakdowns. The only documents recovered were logistical. That silence raised questions. When a crime is committed impulsively, it's often followed by emotional residue, text messages, calls, desperation. In this case, the aftermath was quiet, not because of regret, but because everything was proceeding according to plan. Whether Alicia had insight into that plan remained unanswered. The final action taken by law enforcement was administrative. Alicia Coleman Clark's name was entered into a database for future obstruction or accessory flagging should new evidence surface. As of the closure memo issued in October 2023, no additional leads had emerged. This chapter of the investigation underscored the challenge in distinguishing complicity from proximity. The tools of justice rely on what can be demonstrated, not assumed. But for those left behind, especially families of victims, the difference feels razor thin. After the suspect died and the remains were partially recovered, the case against Marshall Jones III was, in a legal sense, over. But for the Gabe family, closure wasn't defined by a court record or by media headlines. It was measured by answers, ones they still didn't have. No one could explain why only part of Alexis's body had been recovered. Despite months of additional searching in the Amador region, in areas outlined in recovered maps and search histories, nothing more was found. Alexis's parents reviewed every report. They consulted pathologists. They attended briefings with law enforcement that were now administrative, not investigative. But they kept going. They organized volunteer search groups long after state resources had been withdrawn. They printed maps, rewalked terrain, and kept her name alive in public spaces, not to inspire sympathy, but to sustain pressure. This wasn't about hope. It was about accountability. The family petitioned for the release of unsealed evidence files, including body cam footage from Jones's attempted arrest and forensic breakdowns of the recovered materials. They wanted transparency. What they received was a partial window. Some redactions remained. The full extent of Jones's planning and any digital correspondence with others was never disclosed in total. Prosecutors cited investigatory integrity and personal privacy of unrelated individuals. They filed no appeal. They filed no lawsuits. They focused instead on long-term advocacy. In late 2023, the Gabe family began working with California's Office of Victim Services and several state lawmakers to push for procedural reforms in missing persons investigations involving known domestic partners. The proposed measure included an automatic escalation of search classification if the reporting family had documented concerns about a recent breakup or prior control behavior by a partner. It was slow-moving policy, but it was progress shaped by lived failure. Meanwhile, Alicia Coleman Clark, the suspect's mother, never gave another public statement. She remained a controversial figure, protected by prosecutorial standards, but questioned in the court of public opinion. The family didn't target her by name, but they never acknowledged her absence from accountability either. There was a final memorial held for Alexis in Oakley. No cameras, no speeches, just family and a handful of people who had walked through every phase of the case with them. The urn was closed. There was no headstone, only a plaque that read, "You were not erased, you were taken. We carried the rest." For law enforcement, the file was officially archived. A closing summary noted, "Case resolved by death of suspect. Primary evidence sufficient for conviction. No secondary suspects indicted. Recovery incomplete." That last sentence never sat right with the family. In cases like this, where the perpetrator dies before trial, there is no cross-examination, no sentencing phase, no admission of guilt. The justice system closes a folder, but the people affected don't get to move on. They absorb the silence. They inherit the weight of unfinished truth. The Gabe family wasn't naive about that, but they believed, as many families do, that the record still matters. Not because it changes what happened, but because it defines how society remembers what did. They never branded their loss. They never sensationalized Alexis's name, but they insisted she be known for more than how she died. That mattered, not just for them, but for every other family watching their own case stall, waiting for a call that never came or a trial that never will. What this case left behind wasn't just forensic data. It left a template of silence, of partial recovery, of a system that stops when the law no longer has a living subject to prosecute. But justice, in some cases, isn't about courtrooms. It's about keeping the truth intact long after others stop asking. What happened to Alexis Gabe wasn't just a tragedy, it was a reminder that silence, even from those closest to us, can be the most dangerous warning sign. If you've stayed with this story until the end, then you know how fragile the line between trust and threat can be. As someone who's followed this case closely, I've learned this. When something feels wrong, speak up. Don't wait. Protect your boundaries. Value your voice. And if someone disappears from your life without a trace, don't let their story disappear too. What do you take away from this case? Have you ever felt like the system stops too soon? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you're watching from, and what you think justice really means. And hey, if this video reached you in any way, inspired you, or made you think twice about a red flag in your own life, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story that matters.